Hello and welcome to my channel. If you enjoy the paranormal, scary stories, weird and bizarre things that have happened that can be a bit unexplainable, all told in story form, in either soft-spoken or whisper, then you've come to the right channel. So while you're at it, before you put on your headphones and lie back and either close your eyes or watch the candle, hit that subscribe button. If you like this kind of stuff, hit that like button. It does help. And we're gonna go ahead and get started. Haunted mansions and plantations. Our first story is titled A Ghost Visits Mannington Hall. Dr. Augustus Jessup was in high spirits on that chilly autumn night in 1879. Lord Orford had invited him to spend the night at Mannington Hall and had given him permission to examine some very old books in his extensive library. Although Jessup enjoyed the animated conversations with the other guests, he could hardly wait until the others had gone to bed so that he could begin taking notes from the old books in the library. A dentist by profession, Jessup was an antiquarian by hobby. By 11 o'clock, Lord Orford and his other guests had retired for the evening, and Jessup was alone in the library with the treasured volumes. He immediately set to work, taking notes from 6 small books. He had 4 large candles on his desk and a crackling fire in the fireplace. The light was excellent. The evening of stimulating and delightful companionship had left him feeling exhausted. I'm sorry, I read that wrong. It left him feeling exhilarated. Wow, okay. And he felt as though he could work through the night. At 1:30 a.m., Jessup glimpsed something white about a foot from his left elbow. Upon closer examination, the object proved to be a large, extremely pale hand with dark blue veins across its back. Putting his pen aside, Jessup turned and saw that he shared the desk with a tall, solidly built man who seemed to be intent upon examining both the dentist and the books he had been studying. The strange visitor had a lean, rugged profile and auburn hair that had been closely cut. He was dressed in the type of black habit worn by clergymen in the early 1800s, and he sat in a posture of complete relaxation, with his hands clasped lightly together on his lap. After a few moments, Jessup realized that the man was not staring at him at all. Rather, the stranger seemed completely unaware of his presence. Jessup never imagined his visitor to be anything other than a living person, but he did think it most peculiar that he had not met the clergyman earlier in the evening. How had the man entered the room and seated himself so silently at the same desk? It was not until the man vanished before his eyes that Jessup realized he had been visited by a ghost. Jessup was a very stolid sort of individual, not easily frightened or impressed by anything out of the ordinary. After he realized that he had seen a ghost, his most pronounced reaction was one of disappointment, because he had not had the time to make a sketch of the ghostly clergyman. He had returned to his notes, wondering how he could sensibly relate the story of his spectral visitor to Lord Orford. Then the white hands once again appeared beside him. The figure sat in precisely the same position as before, and the expression on his face had not changed in the slightest. The ghostly clergyman still seemed to have an attitude of contemplation or complete relaxation, and he sat with his hands folded on his lap. Jessup turned to give the ghost his full attention. It had occurred to him that he might speak to the spectre, and he tried to form a sentence in his mind. He wanted it to be just the kind of provocative statement that would prompt a ghost to utter a response. Then, before his lips could say a word, the eeriness of the whole situation began to dawn on him. A sense of deep dread and fear began to permeate his entire being. An unconscious reflex knocked a book to the desk, and the ghost vanished instantly at the harsh sound. The story of Jessup's encounter with the ghost became so exaggerated as it was retold by others that the dentist allowed the London, I don't know how to say this, Athenaeum to print an authorized account of the incident about 2 months after the uncanny experience. In the article, Jessup emphasized that he was not in the habit of engaging in flights of fancy, and he did not wish to be regarded as one with mediumistic powers who regularly received supernatural visitations. Nor was he suffering from any problems of the nervous system that would make him susceptible to delusions. The dentist stressed the point that he had been in perfect health on the night of the materialization and had not been suffering from weariness or fatigue. He also stated that the discussion that had taken place at Mannington Hall that evening had concerned itself with travel and art and had in no way touched upon the supernatural. The ghost, he added, did not appear wispy or cloaked in a traditional sheet. The figure appeared lifelike, natural, and so solid that it had blocked the light from the fireplace. After the aforementioned experience, there was no question in Jessup's mind that ghosts do exist. Ghostly Southern Bells at Rocky Hill Castle. Rocky Hill Castle, an old Southern mansion, was built by Reverend Thomas Saunders near Cortland, Alabama in 1828. Until sometime in the 1950s, the castle still sheltered Reverend Saunders' descendants and the family ghost. Once, when he was queried by reporters as to why the Saunders family remained on the old estate for so long, Saunders simply replied that they just happened to love the place. During the interview, Saunders admitted that the family had, on occasion, heard the clanking of chains coming from the basement. However, Saunders stated that they had conducted a full investigation into the disturbances and found nothing that could have produced the mysterious noises. On other occasions, they had heard a persistent tapping coming from the basement. It had long been Saunders' family legend that the sounds were made by the two who built the castle and who had died years earlier. Mrs. Saunders recalled the time she sensed the presence of someone in the room with her. Whenever she turned to look over her shoulder, she saw no one, but the strong feeling that she was being watched remained. Finally, she dared the thing to speak or go away and leave her alone. According to Mrs. Saunders, a voice replied in a whisper, "Sister, do not be doubting, for I am truly here." Yikes. Later that same day, Mrs. Saunders was descending the staircase when she was startled to see a woman she had never seen before standing at the foot of the stairs. The woman was attired in the swirling petticoats of the antebellum era. As a number of nearby towns were celebrating centennial observances at that time, Mrs. Saunders assumed that the woman was a solicitor hoping to secure funds for some historical project in connection with a pageant. Mrs. Saunders recalled that she did not for one moment suppose that the smiling lady at the bottom of the staircase was anything other than a living person. When she reached out her hand to welcome her unannounced visitor, the costume lady vanished. It was as if the voice had materialized a body to demonstrate that it had been truly there. Mrs. Saunders had suffered through all the weird noises in his... Mr. Saunders, excuse me. I'll start that again. Mr. Saunders had suffered through all the weird noises in his old family mansion very patiently. But he was skeptical about his wife's account of the disappearing lady in swirling petticoats. He had never seen the family ghost, and although he was forced to accept the unaccountable noises in the basement, he did not believe in materializing or dematerializing spooks. A few days after his wife's experience with the family ghost, Saunders was in the basement on an errand and was offered dramatic evidence that changed his mind about the reality of ghosts. Sitting on a trunk right before him was a Southern belle from the Alabama of long ago. A family ghost built up through generations of psychic reconstruction can almost become an independent mental mechanism. Whether the ghost actually whispered or Mrs. Saunders' heightened psychic sensitivity allowed her to feel the presence of the ghost prior to its actual materialization makes for interesting speculation. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Sandringham's Christmas Ghost. Servants at Sandringham, one of the country homes of England's royal family, have always found it difficult to sleep. According to those who have inhabited the servants' quarters, the rooms are haunted. A maid who spent several years in service of the royal family said that the disturbances always begin on Christmas Eve. Once the ghost has dumped the Christmas cards on the floor and mussed up the beds, and the servants can look forward to enduring the ghost pranks for a period of 6 to 8 weeks. For generations, the housemaids have known that the most haunted spot in the house is the sergeant footman's corridor on the second floor. Maids refuse to go there alone and will only clean and dust that corridor in small groups. The ancestral ghost is noted for turning light switches on and off. The sound of footsteps it makes in the corridor, as well as the opening and closing of doors. According to one servant, the ghost's most grisly accomplishment is when it makes a wheezing sound that resembles a huge, grotesque lung breathing in and out. Many of England's ancestral ghosts have been explained by marvelous old legends of unrequited love or grim murder. But researchers have been unable to determine any particular incident that could have put Sandringham's ghost in motion. Ghosts occupy the home of William Lyon Mackenzie. When people enter the front door of 82 Bond Street in Toronto, they step into a physically restored scene of the past. Mannequins in period clothing stand about, and in the parlor, a 19th century housewife in a red shawl stands delicately poised with a red paper flower in her hand. People in oil portraits with eyes from another time stare down at the visitors, and a family album resting on a tasseled velvet tablecloth offers stiff faces looking up from the heavy pages. This was the home of William Lyon Mackenzie, first mayor of Toronto and grandfather of William Lyon Mackenzie King, a Prime Minister of Canada. Mackenzie immigrated to Canada in the early 19th century and became a shopkeeper in York. Having a rebellious and stubborn mind, he founded the newspaper Colonial Advocate to provide a means for his scathing attacks on the government. His fiery campaign made him a political hero. Mackenzie was elected to the Legislative Assembly of Upper Canada in 1828 and won re-election 5 times. He became Toronto's first mayor in 1834. Mackenzie died in 1861, but the caretakers of his historic home claim that the ghost of Mackenzie and a lady, either Mackenzie's wife or his daughter Isabel, still walk the halls of the memory-charged mansion. Some witnesses have said that they have seen a third ghost of a small bald man in a frock coat. Mr. and Mrs. Alex Dobin assumed the position of caretakers in April 1960, but resigned after little more than a month because of the effect the place was having on Miss Dobin's nerves. They hadn't lived in the mansion long when they heard the footsteps going up and down the stairs. Knowing that they were alone in the house, they were perplexed by the sound. On another night, they were awakened by a rumbling noise in the basement. At first, they took it to be the oil burner, but Mr. Dobin checked and found that the furnace was not on. They concluded that the noise was the old printing press that occupied one of the locked rooms in the basement. On some nights, they also heard music coming from the piano in the downstairs front room. Caretakers Mr. and Mrs. Charles Edmonds were able to withstand the ghostly manifestations for nearly 4 years before they were forced to leave by the constant oppressive presence of something. Mrs. Edmonds lost 40 pounds from the stress of knowing that an unseen entity was always watching them. On the very day the Edmondsons moved into Mackenzie's house, they heard footsteps on the stairs when they were the only people in the house. One night, Mrs. Edmonds was awakened by something touching her on the shoulder. She opened her eyes to see a ghostly lady standing over her bed, leaning down like a shadow. Mrs. Edmonds said that she could see the ghost clearly. The phantom had long, dark brown hair that hung down in front of her shoulders and that framed a long, narrow face. She vanished after a few moments. For 2 years, Mrs. Edmonds was not again awakened by the lady. But when she reappeared, the ghost left Mrs. Edmonds with physical memento of their meeting. According to the Edmondsons, the lady reached out and slapped Mrs. Edmonds, leaving her left eye purple and bloodshot and her cheek bearing 3 red welts. Mrs. Edmonds also reported seeing the ghost of a little bald man in a frock coat. She would see him for just a few seconds, and then he would vanish. She stated that she had seen the bald man, or the ghostly lady, standing in the 3rd floor bedroom at least 8 or 9 times. Charles Edmonds recalled when their grandchildren, Susan, 4, and Ronnie, 3, visited them in the home shortly after they had moved in. As the children were getting ready for bed one night, they went from their upstairs bedroom down to a bathroom on the 1st floor. The Edmonds soon heard their grandchildren screaming. They ran down to the bathroom and found both children huddled in a corner. The children said a lady had walked into the bathroom and then just disappeared. Although Mr. Edmonds never saw either of the 2 ghosts that seemed to haunt the mansion, he often heard heavy, thumping footsteps on the stairs, as if someone with heavy boots on treading them. On July 1st, 1960, Archdeacon John Frank performed the rites of exorcism in the house at 82 Bond Street. Toronto Telegram staff reporter Aubrey Weiss was on hand to observe the ritual, a means of laying an earthbound spirit to rest. The clergyman decided to consecrate all vital spots of the haunting. The bedroom where Mrs. Edmonds claimed to have been struck in the face was the first stop. Weiss wrote that after the rites of exorcism had been completed, it felt as though the oppressive air that had saturated the house had been lifted. Mrs. Winifred McCleary, the caretaker who was employed shortly after the exorcism, maintained that the oppressive air had not been lifted high enough to suit her. Mrs. McCleary claimed that the house was still very much haunted when she took over as caretaker. She told of hearing the toilet flush by itself and seeing the tap for the hot water turn on its own. "You thought you were in another world in that house," she told Gary Oakes, a Telegram reporter. You weren't alone." Mrs. McCleary remembered that one of the ghosts was not content to just lurk about in the shadows and engage in phenomena of a mildly annoying nature. It wanted to put its arms around people, the woman said. A second exorcism was ordered and seems to have put the ghost to rest. I researched the mansion in the 1960s, but later curators of the house would not answer my queries concerning any continuing phenomena. It seems the caretakers have not actually lived in the Mackenzie house since July 1967, which is not to imply that curators will not reside in the museum because it is haunted. What it does mean is that no one has been in the position to have experiences similar to those encountered by the Dobins, Edmondsons, and Mrs. McCleary. York University history professor William Kilbourne, who wrote a book about Mackenzie entitled The Firebrand, believes the caretakers had valid experiences of some kind or other, and expressed the opinion that he wouldn't go out of his way to spend the night there. The Haunted Ontario website, which is ghosthuntersinc.com, continues to describe the Mackenzie house as being full of spirits. People have reported misty figures and orb-like lights. Lights go on and off. Voices are heard as well as footsteps. One witness saw a woman in one of the bedrooms walk to the window and disappear. There have been many other ghosts and activity reported. Well, that is it for today, folks. I hope you got a little something out of the stories, a little scary. I have to say, I am not a fan of happenings in basements. What is up with these scary basements? Now, when I was growing up in my haunted house, we had a cellar basement. It had the dirt floors, and it had coal chutes, and we used to explore and never think anything of it. I would not go down in there to save my life right now. No, I can't do it. I can't like it. So if you have any scary basement cellar kind of stories, share them in the comments. I'd love to read them on a future broadcast, or email me, and my email is listed in the description box below. So until then, hit that subscribe button. Watch some of my other scary little stories. I try not to get too scary, but honestly, I think all ghost stories can be like mind-boggling. They scare me, but I like to be scared. I don't know, it's weird. So until then, stay a little scared, and I'll be posting here soon.